Hi, welcome to Get Used to It. I'm Sheila Kuehl, your host, or hostess, as you like. Get Used to It is a show that we do around the country on issues of interest to the gay and lesbian community and everybody else. And every so often, sometimes at the end of the year, we do a show that's really about family, because a lot of our issues these days in the gay and lesbian community has to do with whether we are a family, whether we have families, what our families are like, etc. So I want to give you a really cool example of a wonderful family. I have 3 generations here today, essentially to share their lives and their experience with you and with each other, I think is probably the case as well. And I am going to defy convention, and instead of starting with the elder in the family, I'm going to start with, I guess the opposite would be the younger in the family. But to introduce you to them, Emily Gold, who I guess we'll call the daughter and granddaughter, Simone Wallace, the mother and daughter, and Faye Wallace, who is the mother and grandmother, among a whole lot of other things, as you'll see. So as I said, I'm going to start with you, Em.
Okay.
I think the issue for me about our discussion today is really kind of how, as a family with so many changes that so many of you have gone through, kind of how you weathered them, how you felt about, you know, each other and stuff. So I think it would help the viewers if they knew a little bit about you, starting with you, Em, and we'll work backwards through time. Tell us a little about where you were born and where you grew up and what your family situation was like.
Born and raised in Los Angeles. At the age of 2, Mom and my father were divorced, and we were living in Westwood at the time. And my parents both spent equal time co-parenting me because they both lived in Santa Monica. And my father remarried his second wife, and my mom subsequently got in a relationship with another woman. So I spent both times, equal times, between a gay household and a straight household.
So how much do you remember from sort of early on in your life? Did you remember anything about your mom and dad's split up? You were only like 3 years old or something, right?
I was 2, I think.
2.
I have no memory whatsoever of my parents as a couple. I have their wedding picture to remind me that that did occur.
Yeah, I think that's the case with a whole lot of people.
Right.
Maybe especially in LA, but I think not. So tell me, what was it like for you? There's really sort of 2 issues about it. What was it like for you, as so many kids are, being sort of going back and forth between 2 households? And was it a big difference because one of the households was a gay couple, or or were there other differences?
There was a tremendous amount of differences, and that I remember very clearly. With my mom's household, I was an only child, and in my dad's house, I was one of 4 children. I had 3 siblings, and that in of itself was a huge difference, especially considering that I only spent half the time with these other siblings. So I felt part of the family, but also separate in a way because I was only there half time. With my mom, there was much more of a community atmosphere. I was involved very much, I felt, in her life, with the bookstore, with the women's building, with the community, and I related very much to other adults. In my dad's household, there was a very clear distinction between adults and children, and the adults related to each other and the children related to each other, and there was not a lot of intermingling in that respect.
That doesn't sound like it had much to do with sexual orientation, though.
No,
I mean,
not at all.
This is what I hear from all of my friends that grew up in,
I think that was the least of it, because I was so young that when my mom came out, that it felt like this is how I grew up, that there are gay people and there are straight people and there are single people and there are married people, and it just, I think I always grew up knowing that there are differences, and difference was just good. It wasn't something that was bad.
So was that different from some of your friends, though? I mean, did you feel as though you grew up more, I don't want to use the word tolerant, but, you know, more experienced with diversity, or?
Very much. And so much because I was being raised in the height of the feminist movement in Los Angeles. So there was so much going on, not just about sexuality issues, but about feminist issues. And that was just a wonderful experience too. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that there was a lot of engagement with children. And we were part of the family structure. And we would have family meetings in my mom's house. Where I don't remember, once a week or so we would all sit around the dinner table and talk about how we were feeling about being part of the family. And I was about 5. I didn't have much to contribute, but I said I liked the plants. was my contribution.
Well, that was sort of I mean, that's an aspect. Of course, Simone will talk much more about those times in terms of your experience with it, but it seems like an aspect of the time, this sort of the theory of how we would deal with our children.
Yeah.
But were there many women in the community that you were engaged in that had children?
No. You mean of my mom's friends and community? Friends. Not too many. And I think that was nice in a way, because there were a lot of women who I was their, you know, I was their child in their life, and so they related to me on a level where they wanted me as part of their life, because they maybe had come out as lesbians and were not going to be having children in the immediate future anyway. And so there was a very much of a community aspect that included children in some aspects, but I think my mom's going to talk about in other ways that children were not included. So I think it's, but we'll talk more about that later.
So
maybe.
was it weird for you at school, though? I mean,
yeah,
did your friends know that you had 2 moms and
3 moms.
3 moms, that's right. Absolutely.
3 moms.
3 moms and 1 dad.
And it became many more after each got divorced and then remarried again and again. But I always felt different in many ways, and I think it's hard to separate the reasons for feeling different. But I was very conscious of feeling unique in having the family structure that I did, and feeling that I didn't know how to, I think, talk about it and integrate it into sort of what the other kids were talking about with their families. But I felt like it was because they wouldn't understand. I have a very strong memory not feeling ashamed about it or bad about it, that it was something that people just, our society hadn't quite caught up with. You know, I felt like we were sort of cutting edge, and this was the future, and this was consciousness and awareness that people just didn't quite have yet. And so it felt isolating, and it felt very different and lonely, but I don't feel like I felt bad about it.
Mm-hmm. You were never sort of brought to feel ashamed about it. I mean, it seemed like you were very secure. I think I met you when you were 10 or 11.
Right.
And you seemed pretty secure about, you know, your home life, but one never knows. I mean, parents don't even know what their kids go through at school.
Yeah.
You know, and sometimes won't report.
I was pretty secretive about it, and I made a point of going over to other people's houses and sleeping over at other people's houses, and I just didn't invite people to share that part of my life. And it didn't seem that anybody really noticed. It seemed a pretty easy thing to keep secret.
Because a lot of people are ashamed of their parents and don't want anybody to come over to their house for a lot of different reasons.
Exactly.
Well, Simone, Emily has talked about, I think, a pretty unique time, actually, in the history, not only in LA, but I think around the country, in terms of the feminist movement in the 70s, and certainly you will talk about Sisterhood Bookstore, which was a real central place, and I know Emily has talked about feeling a real part of that and loving to be in the bookstore. But starting a little earlier with you, tell us a little bit where you grew up and how, and meeting your husband, etc.
Okay. we came to this country, my parents, brother and I, in the 50s when I was in elementary school from England, and lived in Atwater Village and the Los Feliz area. I went to John Marshall High School, and I went to UCLA, and it was there that I met the man that I married when I was very young. And this was in the late 60s, and it was pretty much what was the plan for me, you know, was to stay at home with my parents and meet a very nice Jewish man, preferably an academic, and that's exactly what I did. And you know, a few years later, it was time to have a child, and we were blessed to have our beautiful daughter, Emily. And in around the early 70s, the women's movement came into my consciousness. The late 60s, early 70s, women started to organize on Crenshaw and Olympic at the Crenshaw Women's Center. And the woman that I met first who was involved actually was the woman that married my brother. And she was going to this women's center, and she wanted to tell me all about it. And as soon as she started talking about the women's movement and feminist thought, it was just, you know, click, 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 thank God. This is what I needed to hear all my life. And especially as a young adult, and especially as a young mother. You know, we had so little support then and so little understanding for feelings, and as soon as I heard the personal is political, the way I took that was, you know, so many insecurities I had. You know, postpartum depression was not ever discussed when I had it, and I was just, you know, isolated. And so to suddenly discover a women's community where we started sharing our thoughts and feelings was just tremendous. And there was a lot of going to meetings, organizing, you know, everything that we have heard about, talk about. I was right in the midst of it. And it was very hard to go home.
Yeah.
It was very difficult. I was very torn. It was a very painful time.
Well, it was, I think it was a real upset for people, because often your life is settled, or you have expectations for your life, and it was such a heady time, kind of a scary time too.
Yeah.
Because it felt like everything was being questioned, and that's a very difficult thing. I think sometimes happiness has to do with, in some people's minds, with just not questioning. Kind of like, you know, leave it alone and it'll be fine, and we'll just bury all the bad stuff underneath. But the women's movement wouldn't let you bury all the bad stuff, because we were incessantly talking about everything.
Yes.
And so it changed your life.
It did change my life, and my very closest friend, with whom I was partners in the bookstore, the bookstore developed out of the Crenshaw Center. We were, you know, 3 politically active women in the feminist movement, and opened the bookstore in 1972. And very soon after, one of my partners, who I said was my closest friend, who had actually married my cousin, was a very much of a family operation, suddenly left her husband, and it was just shocking to me, and set up a new family with her woman partner, and with 2 small children who were Emily's cousins. And it suddenly became harder and harder for me to stay away from that community. You know, we spent more and more time, I spent more and more time with women, with the women's community, and I would go home and it would really start to feel like a foreign country.
So you decided to get a divorce?
I did, yeah. And I will say that I had a really very nice husband. You know, I mean, there was no, I didn't really have a history of extreme negative marriage. It was just that it wasn't a lifestyle that I really wanted to continue. It felt like the institution itself was oppressive, not the actual person.
And was it sort of scary to you to, or, I mean, it's hard for me to speak for you, because it was both exhilarating and scary, as I said, and especially I think when you found yourself, as I assume you did, falling in love with a woman, which was nothing in our generation that was acceptable or allowed. What was your process? How did you, to use the old terms, I mean, you know, how did you come to terms with this?
Well, it's, you know, it's, when you say how did you come to terms with it, I think it's just a continuous process of coming to terms with it in continuing into the present. It's not something that, you know, I didn't feel comfortable and then suddenly I felt comfortable. I think that, you know, coming out, you know, developing an understanding of who one is just, you know, keeps, for me anyway, it's just a lifetime experience. And I think that, you know, when I first got involved with a woman, when I was first in the women's community, I kept thinking that I was developing self-acceptance, and I was there. And now looking back, I just see that, you know, each year I become stronger in who I am, and I, you know, keep reevaluating and, you know, revising my history and re-understanding it.
Well, I want to go back to Emily for a second, because we didn't really talk about what happened to you, Em, as you went on in your life, in terms of your sexual orientation, which I think is an aspect that is an important element of sort of this discussion, because Simone was married and then made this change, but you are now, and always have been, I guess,
always
a lesbian. And was that a difficult thing for you, or easier because you had grown up in this family?
I think I was incredibly fortunate. I feel like my coming to terms with my sexuality was probably the easiest thing that I've had to come to terms with about myself. I recognize at a very young age that I was drawn to mostly women, not girls my age, but particularly women that were part of the community, and it was very much of just wanting to be part of and around just these amazing women in my life. And then I started recognizing that I was having crushes, and I would go to the movies and Tootsie, and I would have a crush on Jessica Lange, and so I was 10, and I said to my mom that, you know, I'm gay too. I don't remember the exact words that I used.
I'll bet she does. I don't know. Simone, how do you remember?
I remember it so well. You see, I, as you said, had a very different experience of, you know, living in the you know, hetero world, marrying, having a child, and later on coming out. And I, without really thinking about it, just assumed that if, you know, any child of mine would do something similar. And I, at that time, I went on speaking engagements periodically, you know, talking about, you know, what it was like, you know, to be gay, and have a child, and how perfectly okay that was, because we had all these statistics, you know, about how the children of gay people don't become gay, you know, and that was, you know, part of the whole conversation about, you know, please don't discriminate against us, don't think we should lose custody, you know, our children grow up to be just like your kids. And then suddenly here's my little daughter, you know, growing up, you know, I guess we would have said a tomboy, growing very much as a little athlete, tomboy, and then one day when she's 10, telling me that, she says, Mom, you know, I think I have feelings about girls. And it was hard for me to deal with it. And I just, like, you know, the stereotype of any mom, I'm saying, well, Emily, you know, you're young. You can, you know, go through so many different changes and thoughts and feelings, and you might feel this way now, but you might not. You know, don't get too set in your thinking. And basically I said, it's just a phase, you know. Wow. And you know, I got over that. I mean, it was just the initial thought. In terms of, anyway, so.
No, I understand, and I'm thinking here about Faye, who's gone through this twice now.
Now you're really going to hear it, right?
Yes, but Faye, start by telling us a little about your life, where you grew up.
The typical British housewife. Never worked, just knitted listened to the radio, and wrote and read, and that was my life. All this was all a big secret. I'm sure you're aware of that. And then my husband, particularly, I mean, we didn't know about such things in England. I mean, even when I went dancing and I'd see a couple of men dancing together, I thought, it didn't seem strange then, because we just didn't talk about such things. But of course, I'm going back now into the, 1950, I came here in 1953. And I have to preface this by saying all this was very secretive. My husband and I used to guess things. We would talk, and I used to say, with Simone, and with Emily, and back and forth and back and forth. And I spoke less and less about it to my husband because I knew his feelings about this. And it was very difficult, to be honest with you, to try and persuade him. And he'd say, I love them just the same. I says, but it's something you have to accept, Les. This is how they are. And then when Emily came and suddenly said that, it was really a shock. Although I suspected it. I really did. And of course at first I'm saying, and Leslie's saying, it's Simone's fault. No, it isn't. She's born like that. I read it in the book. I read it in the book, and he doesn't believe. But eventually he did accept me. You don't stop loving your children.
Well, some people do.
Well, I know that, and that's terrible. I've argued. In fact, I've become so brave lately. See, all my English relatives I talk to are all asking me why Emily's not got a boyfriend, why she hadn't got married. And believe it or not, I was very brave about a month ago when I said, Bertie, my Emily's gay. Oh? She didn't say that, but I knew. And I'm sure the minute she got off the phone, she was on to the rest of the family telling them. But see, it doesn't bother me anymore because it's just a way of life.
Well, it's clear to me.
It really didn't. But it was a shock at the beginning, of course, because it's something I couldn't comprehend at all. In fact, I asked, I'm not even going to go into it, I always ask silly questions about it.
Well, you're not alone, believe me. We've all had parents.
Shall I tell her the question I asked you about somebody?
Sure, go ahead.
I was asking about this young man and everything else. They said, I'm very, very close to, we're very friendly. It is gay. And I said, well, really then, is a woman then? See, because this is how my mind works now, I realise, I understand now that a woman can love a woman and a man can love a man.
Well, but when you...
But it took years.
When you first... I think probably the first shock for you, I mean, I'm thinking of my mother's own reaction to my sister's divorce. My sister is a straight woman and she got divorced.
Disaster.
That was kind of the first...
That was terrible. But I had a feeling that things weren't right between them. He just didn't seem so loving somehow. And once I'd visited them on a Sunday afternoon, he'd been away for something with the Sierra for the weekend. And he came in and he walked across. I mean, you come home after a couple of days, you get hold of your wife, you give her a kiss. Hello, did you have a good time? I went in the kitchen with all the dirty washing and everything. And going home, I said to Les, there's something wrong there. I mean, Les would go out and stay for a whole day, and he'd come home and give me a hug or something. Really. So I understood the divorce. Well, we accepted it, let's put it that way, after a while. But it's something very foreign to me. You understand?
Sure, of course. And did Simone talk to you about this?
No, we didn't.
No. I assume that's what you meant by it was a big secret.
See, if they'd have talked about it years ago, I think I would have understood more. But not knowing and always guessing. And I used to say, who's that woman in the house? Oh, that's Simone's lodger. See? She helps to pay the rent and all that sort of stuff. That was when people asked me questions. because at the beginning I was embarrassed. When you don't understand something and they're not talking about it. So that was why I was grateful when Emily told me right at the beginning. She didn't.
Right at the beginning, 10 years later.
But
Yes, I know.
But you must remember, I mean, it's 20 years ago, it was different then.
Yes, it was. Definitely different.
Nowadays, it's not. It's just, I definitely think it's an accepted thing.
Well, and Simone, I don't know what your experience was, but often these family things, and I think it's fortunate that you're all as loving of each other as you are, because there's a lot of acceptance and a lot of, of love here. But I wonder about your experience with Maureen. I think that was your partner when you had talked to Faye, and I guess to your dad as well about it. What your experience was in terms of their, I mean, I knew you knew that they would be shocked.
Right, and I think that what my mother's saying is absolutely right, because when we, first started being part of the women's community, we had, those of us in my generation, my peers, we had a chance to get used to the idea little by little. And as I'm saying, when my partner, my business partner and friend came out, that was like my shock. And then little by little, I started learning, about what it meant. And so I had a lot more time to get used to it.
Why didn't you tell me then?
Well, I think that what happened was I made many, many false starts. I made many, many starts, sort of checking, what is it, putting your, checking the water,
Putting
whatever
your toe
it was.
in the water.
Yeah,
Right.
And because of whatever the response I was getting, I knew it was no longer safe to continue in the direction of the conversation. And so I do remember exactly when I finally decided it was time to really put this out on the table. And I don't know if you remember it, but I remember I was having a really hard time talking about it, and you said to me, "Are you trying to tell me about the women in your life?" I remember it very clearly, and it was like, what a relief. She did know, she does know. We've talked about it. What I didn't realize, though, that I would have to remind her every few months. I thought you just have one conversation and that's it, but it continues.
Well, it's a difficult thing. I know other parents that I've spoken to, sometimes their concern is, this will be hard for you in society.
Right.
Do
What
you
will the
realize?
neighbors think?
Yes, what will the neighbors think?
Right.
It's
And
an issue.
how will the neighbors
And
treat
also
your
you
children?
had
And
a
the
child.
relations too, they're even worse.
Oh, I know. My mother would never tell anybody of beyond California. That was where the boundaries, for a long time. And then, of course, I became a little more famous as an out person, and there was no hiding it anymore,
But you make things worse, though.
Yes.
You're making things worse for yourself. You're only making yourself miserable by not accepting it anyway.
But you are afraid, Faye, that you will lose that person. I mean, that's the major thing. I don't know if this has been the
Tell
issue,
us.
What?
but you think maybe they won't love me anymore, or maybe they won't talk to me anymore.
Well, that's right. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, you think that.
And that's what
See.
holds people back, I think.
Yeah.
But there was also another issue. I mean, you had a child, and there may have been some concern about what is this going to mean for Emily.
Yeah.
But I wanted to come back to something that Emily talked about, Simone, in terms of this time in history in the 70s, and a number of women who were recognizing that they were gay, but not many of them had children, and there was a whole political issue about children. Did you experience that I mean, you were still a young mother.
Right. As Emily said, there weren't that many women with children. And so we were a little bit of a minority, those of us who had children, but I had a few close friends with children. There was the issue of the boy children. She had a son. And, in terms of separatism and, at what age were boys excluded from women-only space, things like that. But it was very, very different than it is now, when the women's community and the gay community are so child-centered. But as Emily said, she was very unique, and she got a lot of wonderful attention, and made friends when she was a child, that, like yourself, that she's still very close to from that time.
But did you experience any critique from the community because you had a child?
I knew that people were being, were critiquing, but I personally didn't really feel it, no. If anything, I felt like the place that I was, you know, whether it was Venice, West LA, Santa Monica, I actually felt valued, that people really liked having Emily around, and my friends' children also.
And is it different now, Em, in terms of how, I mean, Simone says the community is very child-centered. And you're not a child anymore, but do you experience that? Because you're very active in the community.
There's just a huge surgence of the baby boom. And it's amazing to me. There's a number of organizations that are specifically focused on, you know, the lesbian moms and the pop luck dads and maybe baby for gay people just considering having children. And there's a number of, you know, family-oriented space now that's for parents, gay parents with children. And they're almost, I mean, particularly in urban cities, but there's almost in every school there's a child that has a gay family. And I just think of it as so different from when I was a child.
And how is it different for the kids? I mean, I know you may not know because they're not talking yet, you know.
Right. Well, I do work with an organization called Collage, which is Children of Lesbians and Gays Everywhere. And that's the only organization that is specifically focused around the needs of children who are being raised in gay families. And there is so much support now. Not all kids, particularly when they get to be a teenager, want to, you know, necessarily go somewhere just because there's going to be another kid who also has a gay parent or family. But the resources and the support that are available are so different. And for the most part, what I hear from kids who do participate in Collage is that it's great to have kids, other kids that they know of that have similar family structures and that have gay parents, because the kids you could see, I mean, we all know this, they don't think there's anything wrong with their parents. They don't even know there's anything different about their parents until they go into society and are told this. So there's such an innocence and just knowledge about their family structure. I hear kids, you know, 8 years old, and they tell their whole story of the mom going, you know, to the sperm bank and getting inseminated. And you know, they just talk about it so matter-of-factly, and it's very different. And I think it's also different, a child such as myself who is the product of a heterosexual marriage and then having a parent come out, whereas kids today who are getting older from you know, gay families to gay people deciding to have a child together. I think that's very different.
Yeah, I think it is different. And and why do you think, Simone, in the 70s we had such ambivalence about this family stuff? Because we certainly did. Right.
Well, I think part of it was questioning women's role. And so anything, you know, from the past, which was biological, so it's a little bit absurd really, but we were new at our politics and our philosophy, and we were, you know, trying on different things, and, you know, we had some ideas that turned out to be great ideas and some ideas that we discarded. And so I think that, you know, certain elements in the feminist community or the, you know, radical lesbian community looked upon women who'd been married and had children as having, you know, consorted with the enemy, and here were the products, you know, of those enemy relationships. I mean, that was an extremely radical view, but some of it kind of filtered, you know, around the women's community.
And it must have been painful for some of the mothers. I remember there was an organization in Orange County, the first one I heard of, that had quite a conference, and women drove hours and hours and hours who were mothers because they had no support, who were lesbian mothers.
That's right.
And there was this huge conference, way more than they expected, and a lot of angst about how there was no place to fit in. Their own biological families had said, you know, we're not that, you were lucky and didn't have such rejection, but they said, we want nothing to do with you.
What about if they move into another state though, Sheila?
Yes, right.
It's entirely different.
Nothing there.
It's another world.
Right, it's
then
true.
they'll really be trouble. You're best staying where you are.
But
I mean that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because you read so much about it in the various magazines and newspapers. Even when I was in Phoenix, I noticed that in the newspapers. You know,
Right, you mean more prejudice in other places.
More prejudice, yeah.
But I think also, you know, the fact that I was not a full-time mom because, you know, as Emily said, she was at her dad's half the time, which is a little bit different than the women that were full-time moms, I think, had a greater need for each other and to identify with that.
Well, and you also
movement.
had the bookstore, which was amazing. I mean, not just community for you, but community for all of us. I mean, Sisterhood Bookstore was one of the central meeting places for feminists, you know, to find all of the literature that we wanted to find, but also the speakers and the programs, and it was wonderful.
And to find each other, the resources, Yeah, it was, and Emily, you know, grew up in that.
I remember.
Yeah. I mean, she started working behind the counter when she was barely
she couldn't see over the counter. I know.
27 years is a long time.
Yeah,
it's a very long time.
It's not like bombing borders when they arrived.
I understand. No, it's fine to say. The fact that they moved in right across the street could not have been an accident.
Well, there were a lot of factors that, you know, caused small bookstores to have a very hard time, and a lot of changes in community and in people's needs for community.
But it was a wonderful place for so many years.
The 70s and 80s.
Faye, I think of you as a feminist as well. Would you?
Oh yeah, I'm very involved.
Would you characterize yourself that way though early on? I mean, did you have? Not that you would be unhappy in your marriage. I assume you were not.
Oh,
I mean,
52 years.
52 years, and
52 years.
Seemed pretty good to me.
Wonderful mum. Yes.
But would you characterize yourself as a feminist?
In England?
Well,
they didn't know about feminists in England. The man went out to work, the woman stayed home and did the cooking and the washing with the washing board and all the rest of the stuff.
And did you find it different when you came here in the 50s?
Oh, different?
Yeah.
I loved it the minute I arrived. I mean, it was terrific to have all this stuff. I remember when my brother was in the Navy in England, he came home in 1945, he said, going to America after the war, all the Americans are rich. He was stationed with Eisenhower in the south of England, you know, the tank landing craft. And he came in 48, and gradually we all came here with my mother to an entirely different life. I used to write to my friends, it's wonderful here. The kids leave all the things on the lawn and leave the doors open. In those days. In those days. I'm going back to 53, remember.
Right. So when the feminist movement began and the bookstore opened.
Gradually it came. You know, it took a long time.
Well, I think it's this, I mean, you have certainly been
well, and going into the store
active,
and you see all these women there. Occasionally a man would come in, but mostly the women would come in. I mean, I knew it already. But I very rarely discussed it with Les, because I know at the time, at the beginning, he was upset by it all. We had still had that English gentleman sort of thing. We didn't know about such things. Remember it, you know.
Well, I think even feminism was a threat to many, you know.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing that I know about you and your family, I mean, it's an interesting thing for me to think about the difference in sort of the generations, not just yours as individuals, but sort of the worlds in which you came from and where you grew up, and how much we are kind of children of our time. And I was thinking about your religious devotion as well, because Faye, I know, is a member of her temple, very active in her temple.
Yeah, very, very active.
You, I know, were very active in the sort of the feminist spiritual movement. Certainly that was a big part of the bookstore, as I remember. And Emily, I don't know how we'd characterize it, questioning at the very most about it. And that may also be a generational thing, yet I experience all of you as being, you know, spiritual in your own way. What do you think, Em? I mean, you're the only one that sort of experienced them from,
my temple,
your point of view.
My temple is entirely different. It's a Reformed temple. Our a rabbi, both lesbians, they got married in the temple. So you see, there we are. What are you laughing at?
I don't understand. I missed the point of what you just said.
You remember our assistant rabbi that moved up north and they adopted the baby? She had a baby.
I actually didn't
adopt the
remember
baby.
that. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that is
And
that is a whole new temple.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's been a very big change.
Leo Beck,
in the
there, right
religion.
opposite the Getty Museum.
Yes, right, right.
Rabbi Bierman, you must have heard him.
Sure, of
He's been
course.
arrested about 25 times.
For only good things, of course.
Of
Right,
course.
yes.
Of course.
Of course. He went,
But it was different for you, Simone. I mean, I don't know, maybe this is too personal, but I'm also interested in it because so many families go through those changes as well. That's not about sexual orientation, but it is also an aspect of our times, and I'm not quite sure because I'm, you know, more Simone's generation, how to kind of characterize sort of the spirituality of your generation, Em.
I've always felt very disconnected from my Judaism. I, you know, identify as a Jewish person, and some of the cultural Jewish aspects I feel possibly connected to, but religion and the institutions of the temples and even the traditions of the different holidays, I feel very disconnected to. And I think that I go through the motions mostly to please my grandmother.
thank you.
You're welcome. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of meaning on a personal level.
Do you find that in a number of your friends, or?
Yes, yes. And I think that's because I seek out like-minded people. So I don't think that's would be a majority of my generation. Maybe it is, but I certainly haven't had a hard time finding people that I relate to on, you know, a lack of a religious level.
Right. Well, in a way, it's very much the same thing. I mean, we believe what we believe, and we think, I know you think, that it would be also good for, you know, the other generations of your family to experience the joy that you do, and yet that's not how it turned out.
And I know that it's very painful for her.
It is.
Well, I mean, but it's the same thing as the sexual orientation discussion, if you know what I mean.
Right.
It is, I know that this is a good thing, because I learned this, but I also experienced. You experienced your marriage as a very good thing.
I feel it would be such a tremendous help for her. I really do, if she got involved, because it isn't.
What do I need help with?
Now, we don't need to do all of this discussion here.
It's going the wrong way, I can tell. Continue.
Well, but my point really being
Yes.
that it's very similar. Sexual orientation is not the only difference that we all have in our families.
Right.
In terms of what, you know, my mother and father really thought was a good thing for me. Now, my mom and dad, my dad was Catholic and my mother was Jewish, so we never discussed religion in my family, at least in terms of what was better or what was worse or whatever. But they were both people of faith, and it was, my mother was more of a naturalist about her faith. She did not go to temple. Women were not, you know, necessarily always going. But she had more of a sort of a household spirituality. And I don't know, Simone, how would you characterize kind of, was it about at the same time that feminism was happening that you explored, or?
No, I think that from a very early age I was not interested in really traditional Judaism. And we did belong to a temple when I was growing up. And, you know, somewhere in the 50s and 60s, you know, I sort of started becoming a very anti-establishment kind of person, which included religion.
And so was my father.
Yeah.
He
and
was even more extreme.
Right.
And still is.
However, when we met, we did decide that to please our families, we would have a Jewish wedding, and we did. And so there's always been a link for me to Judaism. And then at the same time that the women's community was going through all of the various consciousness raising, as we talked about earlier, one of them was about our backgrounds, our heritage, and our religions. And I was in a Jewish women's support group and got involved with the gay temple, got interested in feminist synagogue. And, you know, I was pretty active for a long time, and now, you know, I feel like I'm not any longer.
And was there any connection about, because a number of people have said, well, my religion rejected me, and therefore I kind of rejected
Yeah, I don't feel that my religion
rejected
me. And I feel very connected to my religion. I mean, I'm a big reader, and I read Jewish-themed books. I see, you know, Jewish-themed films. I'm very, very interested in history, especially, you know, I study World War II a lot. You know, I'm very connected to, you know, issues about the Holocaust and survivors. You know, because my family, we were in England at that time. It was a
temple with me.
It was a scary.
She goes to temple with you. I know. I've seen her.
She's on Yom Kippur.
But in terms of, you know, my personal inner life, I don't feel particularly interested in an organized Judaism, but I'm very glad that there is. I am very connected to Judaism, just not to synagogue Judaism.
Well, it's just interesting to me because we have it's sort of like another, not a necessary progression, because every family hasn't gone that way. There would be, you know, atheists in the grandparents' generation, and a resurgence of, you know, orthodoxy in another generation. But you're working on it. She's very young. You know,
you're working on her resurgence.
We change as we get older.
You can always hope.
In this way, I'm my father's daughter.
Yeah, I understand. Well, let me ask you, Faye.
Yes, what, love?
What advice would you give to parents and grandparents in terms of their kids, if they think their kids are gay, or their grandchildren, or they come out to them? What advice would you give them?
I can't understand them suddenly not loving a person. I mean, it's your child, your grandchild, whatever. How can you stop loving somebody? That's ridiculous. They're just bigots. No, really. It's something I can't understand, and I haven't come across that, fortunately.
In your friends?
No,
do you have others in your generation with gay kids or gay
we talk about things like that. But I can't understand. If you love somebody, how can you suddenly dislike them?
Well, you might be terrifically disappointed. I mean, I know that's what some have said. I'm so disappointed I can't.
But then a part of your life's gone. Then I mean, I can't imagine not talking to Simone. I mean, we have arguments and all kinds of things like everybody else does. But we get friends again. But I can't understand that. I really cannot understand that, sincerely. I don't understand that.
Well, what, though, if they felt that way? What would you say to them?
If I ever came across anybody like that, I would just talk and talk and talk and make them see some sense. Because it's stupid. Well, life is too short to do.
And Simone, you're in the middle of the sandwich, as it were,
Yes.
because you had the experience both of coming out and being come out too. Wait, I don't know what that's.
Me driving her crazy.
Yeah, that syntax is not too good, but you know what I mean.
Fine. Yeah.
What advice would you give to, well, you know, people who need to come out to their parents? Because you know everybody's afraid of it.
Tell them at the beginning.
I'm asking Simone here.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the more places that you can be yourself, no matter how you imagine it's going to be painful or it's going to hurt, ultimately, there's, you know, so much value in it. It's a risk, and often the things that are the riskiest end up being the most meaningful when you take the risk and come out on the other side. Come out on the other side.
It is kind of on the other side. I remember there was I think it was in the old days, a Shell gasoline commercial where there was a car hurtling towards a brick wall, and then it drove right through, and it turned out that the brick wall was really just made of paper.
Very nice image.
It felt that way to me, you know, when I came out to my parents finally, as though they had been standing outside my closet, you know, kind of waiting for me to trust them enough. And actually, it hurt them more that I didn't trust them to tell them than it hurt them when I told them, which was completely the opposite of what, you know, I thought it was going to be.
I think the most difficult, though, Sheila, is for the orthodox, the right-wing, as I call them. Really, they will never accept it. Things like Chabad and all that group, they just, and it's unbelievable. But it's true.
Well, it makes it very difficult for the families.
They won't even shake your hand. A man won't shake your hand in that thing. A woman, no way. You're separated. You know. I don't think it'll ever change either.
Well, you don't know what's going to ever change. I mean,
Oh
we've
my
all gone through a
God,
number of
I can't
changes.
imagine
Yeah,
the
I
type
know.
of
It's hard to imagine, but
the
yeah.
stubbornness there. I saw it when I was in Edmonton with the group, just like that.
Well, it makes it very difficult for the families too.
Of course.
So what advice would you have then as a parent to the other parents? Because
to other
there's going to be a
parents?
lot of kids coming out to their
Oh.
parents. I just know that's going to happen. You know?
Advice to, I'm sorry, the parents?
Yeah.
You have only everything to gain. There's absolutely nothing, not to gain by, having closeness, openness, knowing your children. Emily and I are very, very close, and it's just a great source of pleasure. And, who would not want that in their life?
Well, what do you think leads them to say, I never want to see you again, get out of the house?
I think there's just tremendous fear. People have such tremendous fear about having to change values that they've always had, and if they suddenly change one little value, what else will have to change? A questioning of their, entire being. And some people just really don't want to have that happen. They just need things to just remain as they, have always had it.
Yeah, I guess that's true, but
Take a leap.
At a huge cost. I mean, a huge cost.
Right.
How about you, Emily? What advice would you give? I mean, so far you haven't been a parent, but you have certainly been a kid and a grandkid. What advice would you give?
I've just been incredibly fortunate that I've had an opportunity to be myself and always felt that whatever that is was completely accepted. But I think I always would encourage people to be themselves and to, to express themselves and to articulate their feelings and their thoughts, and just to always engage in dialogue about everything, including their personal life. And from a very young age, I think it's, we have a great relationship, and I see how unique that is with my friends, and they're close to their parents, but I feel like we have a very unique closeness, and I think a lot of that is because of the emphasis on communicating and having dialogue about the world and who we are.
Well, I want to thank all three of you. I mean, I don't know whether you knew what you were getting into. I know you're all friends of mine, and I really appreciate that you would be willing to do this, because I just like people to see who our families really are, and the fact that it's not incredibly impossible, but it's also not easy either, that people go through their changes, but that really love is kind of the triumphant virtue. And you certainly embody that. So thank you, Emily, thank you, Simone, and thank you, Faye.
You're
and
very
thank you
welcome.
for being with us too. We hope that you will take from this that, it's sort of like old saw about how love conquers all, which it does, and be sure that you don't deny yourself any of that if you can get it. And I hope that you'll get used to it.